Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Shmoo meeting at IETF 109. I know it's probably going to be really early or really late wherever you are. So thank you very much for making the time and getting here. It's really important that we get like this work moving faster. And so like pandemic is here with us for a while, and we hope to have some kind of practices like agreed upon in the community as soon as possible. So thank you. So putting in the note well, like I'm sure you've seen it a lot of times, we make sure that we show the slide just to make sure that anything you contribute here is covered by the rules of RFC 5378 and 8179. So the details are in the RFCs and the links. And as far as the agenda goes today, first of all, we would like to ask for a minute taker in JavaScript. So I spoke to Braun earlier. So Braun, thank you very much for volunteering to take the minutes. And since we have Etherpad, if like anybody else can help him out, please. Again, greatly appreciated, Braun. Like you did awesome job last time, and thanks again for doing it. And would someone like to be the JavaScribe? Just watch for questions. Like I think is like less important now with like Meet Echo being on there, but in case like somebody doesn't want to speak up, like it'll be good if somebody can relay questions from Jabber. Any volunteers?
Yeah, this is Charles. I can do that.
Thanks, Charles. Thank you. And when Charles is presenting, probably Amelia and I will watch the Jabber room. Thank you, Charles. And we'll just go over quickly over the status of the deliverables. Like, we have a set of deliverables in the charter, and just go over like where drafts exist and so on. Like we are a pretty new working group, so like almost 4 months old now. So we are like pretty early in the life cycle, but we'll just go over what are the drafts that are present, and then we'll look at the agenda of the presentations and talk about next steps. So like the first deliverable is really to have the guidelines and principles for canceling in-person meetings and replacing them with like fully virtual meetings. And Martin has a draft that targets this deliverable. I think it's like something that like addresses like a lot of the questions people have and the considerations that need to be made. Martin will present this today, and we can talk about like whether this covers like everything we need to do, or is there something missing in there. And the second deliverable is like meeting planning and replacement meetings. And there's like a bunch of drafts in this space. Like Mallory has written one of those drafts. Like Michael has written another one, and Charles has done something specifically for the hackathon piece of it. And so I think between these things and potentially some missing stuff, I think we can meet this deliverable at some point. But there's like quite a bit of work to do. Like as you know, there's like a lot of them are like 0.0 or like 0.1 drafts, like very recently published. So there's like a bunch of time like we need to iterate on these before we get anything close to moving forward. And on the technology front, like actually Amelia and I were expecting a lot more action in this side than what we've seen. So the only draft that kind of exists in this space is really, again, Martin's draft, the show of hands draft. So like, this was kind of like a replacement for the virtual hem draft he talked about last time. It's like a slightly different take on the things. But there's like a whole bunch of stuff missing here, at least like that's kind of how we feel about it. And so specifically about the meeting technologies and so on, to write down the requirements. Like I think there's like probably some more work to do in this area to like try to meet the deliverables here. And the final thing is like, the guidelines for meeting fees. And like Miria, John, and Rich, like they have the draft, which talks about like, the meeting fees for such meetings. And I think like it has been like revved already, like, with like a lot of comments addressed. And if it'll be possible, like, we'll try to do a show of hands today and go for adoption of this draft on the mailing list, like if there are no concerns. So any concerns with the agenda, like, the order of stuff or things like that? So Martin, I know you have a conflicting meeting. Is this like, presentations towards the end? Is that okay with you?
Fine, I've given up on attending that other meeting. I don't have to be there. I just wanted to be.
Okay,
So
thanks, Martin. Thank you.
We have a question in the chat now, whether we have allocated any time to a general discussion. From
Yeah. So Larry, we have quite a bit of time at the end. I can actually put in a specific agenda item for it, or we can just like run over into it. So we have about 45 minutes, at the end of the meeting. So we don't have a full agenda today. So I think certainly, we can open up the floor. Okay, thanks, Larry.
Okay, I'll try to fix that.
Yeah. Okay, so for the next steps, we'll try to do a couple of adoption calls and like go iterating on like missing pieces, find them, and try to solicit drafts. So thank you everyone for like writing up the drafts. So sometimes like we are a bit naggy. So thanks a lot and for putting the effort and putting the drafts together. I know this is not like an easy set of topics. I know there's like a lot of people who have very different opinions. So thank you very much for doing that. So we'll continue to do that. So just switching back to the presentations, I'll just stop sharing this and I'll switch to the next presentation.
All right. Okay. Great. Thanks. So hi everyone. John Reed from Akamai here to talk about this draft that Miria, Rich, and I wrote. So I assume most everyone has read the draft, but basically, why are we doing this? Remote attendance essentially has always been free prior to IETF 108. And while asynchronous participation in working groups over email has not fundamentally changed, it's really clear that attending the working group sessions gives people an advantage to hear discussion happening in the room. And we can talk a bit more about what attendance means on the next slide. There was some lively discussion on the mailing list about that, but there's clearly benefit gained from being in the room. And while there was a fee waiver for IETF 108, there were some challenges publicizing it. But in short, basically, somebody who attended, say, IETF 106 for free remotely might have been deterred by the fee for IETF 108 and later IETFs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's what we're proposing, that there must always be an option for free remote participation in any IETF meeting, whether or not that meeting has a physical presence. And this really aims to support the openness principle in RFC 3935, which specifically states any interested person can participate in the work, know what is being decided, and make his or her voice heard on the issue. And we've gone a bit further to say basically any free registration option must offer the same degree of interactivity and functionality available to paid remote attendees. It must be clearly and prominently listed on the website and registration page. And if there are additional steps, such as a fee waiver, the requirements and process should be clearly documented. Next slide, please. So I'd like to thank everyone who participated in the discussion on the mailing list. We spawned some really interesting topics. There was an initial discussion about whether the fee waiver should apply to in-person attendance whenever we get back to that. There was also a lot of interesting discussion around the definition of participation. We heard from folks that the audio stream links were initially motivated in their early days by challenges in getting multicast working for a lot of folks. There was also some assertion that a unidirectional audio stream plus the Jabber room prefixing your comment with Mike was sufficient for participation, as was watching the YouTube videos afterwards. But really, regardless of how we got here, we've had really truly interactive participation with MeetEcho for some time now, and it's a far more interactive experience than any of the previous methods, and that's what we'd like to focus on. There was also an interesting discussion around, well, if there's a free option, won't everyone just use that? Which also spawned some really interesting side chats about whether people view themselves as attending on behalf of their employers, as individuals, et cetera. So that was great discussion, and I think it raised some interesting points, but that's mainly a topic for another time. There was also general agreement that transparency and data was important. Who's using the free option? Can we make them say why? Well, that's a little bit burdensome, but what we ended up at was collecting some data so that we can perform analysis in the future. Next slide, please. So we incorporated a lot of that feedback, released the 01 version. We added some additional considerations on the use or misuse of the free option. We didn't really specify any firm guidelines, and that's intentional as to whether any given use of it is acceptable. But we, pointed out that that concern exists and is valid. And a recommendation to publish a breakdown of registration types so that we can do some analysis and see how the free option is being used, how many people are taking advantage of it, and as time goes on, whether there are any trends that we can infer from that. But we deliberately did not want to get into the business of calling out an acceptable use of the free option. Sorry, yeah, next slide, please. Thanks. So what are the next steps? As Suresh mentioned, we'd like to seek working group adoption on this, and that's where we'd like to go. So,
Thank you. Thanks, John.
And so last slide is just Q&A. Thanks again to Miria for coming up with this idea, Rich for contributing, and both of them for letting me be the one to talk about it.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Martin, I'll let you go first.
Yeah.
Thanks for this draft. I like the basic thrust of it, and I think it's a great basis to continue to work on it. And I support adoption. I would ask that you explicitly state in the draft that you are not making any judgments on what is acceptable use of the fee waiver, because that's kind of a question I immediately had, and I was going to ask, but you told me. But putting it actually in the document would be great. Does this mean to take an opinion on whether or not it would be acceptable for IETF to cap the number of fee waivers?
That's an interesting question. I don't think we've taken any position on that. We have noted, obviously, that there is an inherent cost in holding some meetings, but we haven't specifically talked about a cap on the number of registrations, because I think that would be challenging, but we can certainly consider it. Talk about it.
Well, the ISG and the LLC struggled with that a little bit between 107 and 108, and we ended up not having a cap here. But I guess the question is maybe an empirical one, that if we have a cap, is that inducing people to shell out to attend, or is it inducing people to not attend? And that was kind of an open question that we ended up not really having to resolve, because our budget is okay at these virtual meetings. But it's an interesting question. I don't know if this draft has to say something necessarily, but I was curious. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay. Ted?
I like this document in general. One thing that I didn't see explicitly in there that I think might be useful is, right now you kind of have the tension between paying and not paying as being, people who need the ability to not pay should have it, but we also need to control misuse of that. It might be helpful to reframe that instead as people who can ought to pay because paying is good, as opposed to people who don't pay because, for no good reason, or bad. In other words, just kind of like frame it in terms of the positive benefit of paying the membership fee if you're able to, rather than the negative of trying to control people not paying the membership fee. Because right now I see it framed a lot of times as like the IETF is bad for charging for this, and I think it's important to make it clear that that's not so.
Great, thanks. I'll take a note on that.
Okay. Amelia, you're next.
Yeah, so it's kind of a similar points to Ted, but a bit different. And I wanted to ask everyone in the room, as well as the draft authors, if we would be able to foresee staged registration fees. So for instance, you could imagine that an individual who participates in a personal capacity has an option to pay a lower or a higher fee, depending on what they determine is their capability, whereas somebody who goes on behalf of a corporate entity might not have this option. And this is a system which is commonly implemented in European hacker camps, or like, and it could be a way to give people an option to pay more or less, depending on what they perceive to be their specific capability for that meeting.
Cool, thank you. John or Miria, did you want to respond to that, or Miria, did you have another question?
I was just going to quickly ask, in the examples you gave, are people self-selecting into those tiers, or are they? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they self-select, but actually a lot of people typically for those meetings end up self-selecting higher payment bands than they technically need to select. So it's at least for some types of meetings, it works very well. And as far as I know, the abuse is not extensive.
Thanks.
Yeah, I
Miria?
want to kind of respond to this and Martin's comment as well. So I think that's actually a separate topic. And like this draft doesn't talk about the payment structure at all, because that's really a topic for the LSC, because they have to figure out how to finance this. It's really about this case of free participation, because even like a small payment is a barrier to people who kind of just want to have a look or whatever. And that's something we have been benefiting a lot from, to attract new people and so on. So this is like really covering this one specific case. I mean, maybe we can make a note that the LSE should think about more options or whatever, but I think it's really a separate question. And to reply to Martin about putting a cap, it didn't even occur to me that you would consider that, because this principle is really phrased so broadly that, you know, there shouldn't be any restrictions. And again, I think not a cap itself, I think you can state this explicitly, because I think this is really against the principle we are stating, having a cap. But like, you know, if the LSC observes that like the number of free registrations increases too much, so it's not viable anymore, then kind of this is a financing problem, and then they have to handle it in some way. And that's why we say we should like observe the number of free registrations and figure out if there's like a trend or whatever. But then again, we don't give advice what to do, because it's about the financial part, and that's really not the decision of the draft here.
Okay, Miria. Miria, do you want to stick on in case like any questions are there for you?
Sure.
Okay. Steve, it's yours.
Yeah, I was just about to get out of the queue because Miria said what I was going to say, more or less. I think what you said, and I like the idea of lower fee rates for different interested parties according to certain categories, but that should be an LLC thing. So it was already said. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks. Rich, did you want to add anything there, or? Rich, I think you're muted.
That we tried to keep in the front of mind when preparing, you know, the draft and its revision, was to make sure that there was no categorization or way for people to look down on those who got free who took advantage of the fee waiver, such that make sure it's not identified in any public registration material. There's no special dots, things like that, you know, for whenever we meet face to face. And if there's going to be levels of financial levels of participating, that I would think the LLC, again, as others have said, is probably the right place to do that. We need to make sure that that is also carried forward. You know, if you work for one of the FANG companies and your companies agreed to pay double whatever the regular rate is, that doesn't mean you get twice as much mic time or anything like that, right? You get twice as much mic time because of who you are. But it's something I think we need to keep in mind. And I would also like to keep it separate from this document, which is really all about preserving the importance of preserving the open participation aspect of our meetings. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Phil, you're up next.
Hi, yeah. I was just going to point out that we have a few problems here because we're all participating as individuals, if we remember. Nobody's participating on behalf of the company officially. And so we have to, you know, we've got to keep open that fiction along with everything else. And that kind of makes this a bit more complicated. But the other thing that I suddenly realized was that we're doing this the wrong way round. First of all, we've got to work out what the product is going to be, then how much it's going to cost, and then at the end, work out how we're going to pay for it. At the moment, we're assuming a certain model of how the meeting is going to work. I mean, one way that strikes me that could make the IETF an enormous amount of money would be to have a tutorials day appended to the front of it and charge companies to train up their people on the state-of-the-art in IETF protocols. And you know, that stuff used to go, when I did those courses, I used to charge $800 per person a day for an in-person course, and I believe that the current rate is $200 per person for remote, and they don't need to be experts to attend. And so I think that we should bracket the question of how to pay for it until we've decided what we're actually going to do with these meetings.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Miria, Rich, John, did you want to say something, or should I just move on to the next person?
The purpose of this document is to put a stake in the ground about preserving our openness. Whatever we do, we want to make sure that there's an avenue for openness. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
I think
specifically
that-
weren't going to talk about funding. Yeah.
I think that question is a much broader discussion, which you might want to start in a different mailing list or whatever, or a different draft for it. I also think that like the product we're having is the RFCs we're producing and not the meetings. So anyway.
Fair. And the mailing list discussion, Miria, of course, but yeah. Okay, thanks. Tolos, you're up next.
Okay, the mute button. This reminds me of California propositions, right? So basically where everybody was going forward and saying, here's the stuff we like, and we don't care how somebody else figures out how to pay for it, right? So I would also chime in on the side of people saying that this document should show that the community who basically wants to maintain a particular principle of, you know, open or free access to the creation of the product, right, is also, you know, thinking of and taking responsibility on for, you know, figuring out how to make it happen pay-wise, and that it's not shoved off to another community. So, you know, in the most simple case, that would mean there is a section discussing this. In another, you know, case, it means that this working group itself should have an associated document that takes on these things, like the thought that Phil was giving, or others in terms of how to do it, right? I mean, when I was listening to Jay on the plenary, I mean, there was time for 2 beers through all the sponsorships. So heck, I mean, think about further gamification of people, you know, make it more fun for them to pay the money, right? I mean, even for the individuals, right? As Phil was saying, right, we're all individuals, and any individual participation fee could be seen as a sponsorship, right? So in any case, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there was specifically actually when we discussed the fee waiver as it was implemented like last time and this time, there was especially a request from the LSE to provide guidance on this level, to provide guidance about what the community wants so they can figure out how to realize that. I have also opinions about how the IETF should be financed. And that's probably also a discussion the community can have opinions on, but I would really like to keep that separate and move forward here quickly so we give the guidance to the LSE that they need.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Maria.
I would
So
agree. I would. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, John. Yeah.
I was gonna say, yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think to continue that analogy, by adopting this document, we are saying this, we would be saying this is important, and like Miriam said, provide that guidance.
Yeah, as I said, right? It's going to look off somewhat dishonest and shoving off the problem to somebody else by just talking about the wonderful principle that should be upheld, right? So let's make sure that we do the best to figure out how whoever the community needs to adopt this is going to show how to take responsibility for how to finance it.
So I have a lot of opinions here. I think being dependent on the meeting fee has been a problem for a while. This independent of this change, and what we see right now is that actually offering a free waiver didn't impact our financing because people have been honest and registered and paid. So currently, that's not a problem that we have with this proposal. It's a general problem that has been there for a long time.
So specifically speaking, Tolos, right? I think one of the things that is explicitly written out of the charter is any discussion of the IETF funding model is out of scope for us. So I do see a point, and I do think it's something we need to consider as a community, but it's not a work item for us here. And I know it's a difficult thing, and probably watch out for any signs of abuse or the tide kind of going the other way. Is something we absolutely need to watch out for. So thanks for chiming in. Okay. So just I saw a lot of plus ones and support adoption on the Jabber room. I just want to ask for anybody if you don't think this is a good starting point for a draft in this for the registration fee deliverable. If you can get in either put something in the Jabber room or come up and speak. I'd love to hear that. Thank you. So we'll send out a adoption call on the mailing list. Thank you very much. Thanks, John, Miria, Rich. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Suresh. Thanks, Amelia.
Thanks. Mallory.
Hey, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Morning. Yep.
Good. Great, so I can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I've written a draft that, actually, it's really nice that Shmoo has been chartered, so thanks very much to the chairs. Before Shmoo was officially a working group, there was mini couches, and I think I had mentioned my interest in talking about asynchronous meetings as far back as then. So it's been nice to be able to document this. And my co-author is not here. But Carol works for the Association for Progressive Communication, and I'm at the Center for Democracy and Technology. And Suresh, you can just advance. Yeah, perfect. You can go to the next slide, please.
Okay.
So the purpose is, I think because of the pandemic, we might be thinking about different ways to meet online. As the Bangkok 109 meeting is a good example. Sometimes meeting all in the same time zone is really difficult. And since we're not all in the same place, it's complicated. This is just an alternative, perhaps for some working groups or research groups that don't feel like they have enough reason to share the pain and get all online at the same time. And just, I think it can actually, depending on what working groups or research groups are trying to achieve, a text-based meeting might actually be very productive. So it's just another alternative. I wanted to present some experiences I've had in the past with these asynchronous meeting styles. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go ahead and read the abstract. I mostly just said all of that, but I will talk a little bit about the idea of using a mailing list. So the point being that if you have an asynchronous meeting that is text-based, it would make sense to continue using existing tools. And the obvious one then is mailing list software, because all of our working groups and research groups already have those anyway. So this is just a way of offering guidance for how to use mailing list software to actually have a meeting. An asynchronous meeting doesn't necessarily mean it's open-ended. The idea is it's actually really well structured and tightly facilitated in, time bound. It's just instead of 1 hour where we're all synchronously meeting, it's over a few days, or as was suggested on the list recently in response to the draft, maybe a week is a good guideline for a working group or research group meeting. So I also wanted to just talk about my experience with this. So when I worked with Carol, was my colleague once upon a time. I worked at the Association for Progressive Communications for 6 years, and they have a membership that spans, every continent essentially. Was founded in the late 80s, early 90s. So by mostly global South organizations. So their membership is always needed, like a really low bandwidth, easy way to meet occasionally. And so that is what they did. Every year the membership met online through mailing lists, except for triennially, they would then try to get together face to face. That didn't happen actually in 2020. They were meant to have a triennial member meeting as well. So this is where I learned these tactics, and the place where I participated in my first online asynchronous meeting. And it's really tightly done by now, since they've been doing it for a couple decades. Next slide. So the draft really just documents the basics for how to do this. So I go into why a little bit more, which I think I'm done doing now, and then try to offer some advice for how to do it, both like for all stages of it, before in the really critical planning stages, because again, it's all about like well done facilitation. Also then during, what a facilitator or co-chair would need to do during an asynchronous meeting, and then also an important stages afterwards when you're trying to actually distill the tons of text that have just been generated into meaningful outcomes. Then there's a section on considerations that I think are things that have been introduced newly given this format. And then I try to use some examples and annexes so people actually understand what it is I'm talking about. Okay, next slide, please. I'm not going to go ahead and read all of the things that I write in the how section. You can definitely read the draft on this, but there's some highlights that are kind of just like lessons learned and the best way that we found to do this well. Of course, we're open to other things. Like if we can find more examples, we'll add to this list. But some things that come up again and again. Like for one, Carol is the membership coordinator for the APC, and he can tell you that it doesn't matter how many times you send an email or how well formatted that email is, when you're dealing with hundreds of people, there's going to be tons of questions on and off list about the logistics. So there's a need for like a space where you can put information about the logistics of a meeting. Data Tracker is already really good for that. It might need to be slightly tweaked to accommodate meetings like this, but I think actually as is, it works really well. You've got the materials, you've got the agenda, you can put the details there. But that's not going to stop people from asking, even if you've documented it really well. Yeah, go ahead.
Mallory, would you like to take questions now, or you want to hold them till the end? We have somebody at the queue.
Oh, I'm going to hold until the end if that's okay.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Another one is that having an agenda defined in advance is really key, and not just having here are the items that we're going to talk about, here are the drafts that need to be worked on, but actually figuring out in advance what the outcomes are so that facilitators and co-authors can steer conversation towards those outcomes is really important, to not keeping it so open-ended that it's just like a bunch of posting, right? There are ways in which one can use mailing list software wisely that can help focus discussion. So it's not just, all right, everybody, we're going to be present on an email list all at the same time for a week. It's you can thread different discussions and facilitate them individually and that sort of thing. There's in the APC meetings, because of the nature of the organization, but I think I also see this in the IETF as well, there's a need for people to be human, and it's always nice to bake something in to make the meeting feel like it's a moment in time for people working together that know one another. So I always suggest some kind of social thing. Also just, maybe a thread within a meeting to actually have some off-topic discussion to emulate the ways in which an in-person meeting would happen, in the hallways and that sort of thing. And then, it cannot be overstated how important follow-up notes are. Even though everything is textual and you can go back and read everything that's happened, you have to sort of be able to draw conclusions from it and create a shared narrative about what happened. And that is just a different problem. Like instead of recording notes as conversation is happening, you actually just have to go back and read everything and distill it down to its key components and then present that as a report. So those are just, like I said, some highlights. That's not a full view of what is in the draft. So go ahead, just for the purposes of this presentation. I didn't want to bore you. Then the consideration section, which will probably change based on a little bit of list traffic already. These, I think, are things that are newly introduced for better or worse, given the change in format. So it might be that people who are subscribed to a working group or a research group list does not accurately reflect the active membership or people that would come to a face-to-face in-person meeting. And so therefore, you can't just assume that because somebody is subscribed to a list that they are an active participant. I think that just goes without saying, but there was some discussion about this and how to, like in particular, how to deal with a meeting fee. Like if it were to be part of an IETF official meeting instead of an interim, like how do you actually worry about somebody's participation and whether or not they've paid to talk on the list, right? Another one is actually a positive thing. I think that it's worth noting that for the purposes of accessibility and in particular, multiple language translation, text-based meetings can be very helpful. That was one of the reasons why it worked so well in the APC, because spanning lots of continents, you also then span lots of languages, and the official languages of that network are French, Spanish, and English. And so it allowed for people to post sometimes in their own language. There were threads or group discussions that were in specific languages only. And then furthermore, for people who, even if the meeting is all in English, it just means that for folks who need a little bit of extra help doing their own translation, they have that because they have the time to actually do translation of text. text is notably easier to read in a second or third language than like live speaking and hearing. Then also there's just the comportment around how to like, have a nice friendly discussion on a mailing list. We got into this in the Shmoo list a little bit, that it's hard sometimes when folks don't know how to use mailing lists, or that have maybe different uses of mailing clients or not at all, and how that can be a challenge. It might be useful to document that at some point, but I don't think that that's a good use of this draft, actually. And then lastly, the compliance section, which might just go wholesale. I was just worried about things like, the note well applies apparently to mailing lists, but in a meeting we see the note well before we start. How would that work if we were all just on a mailing list, right? Okay, that's it. I think next slide. Maybe I have more. Yeah, I do. So I think the two main points from the list discussion so far, although I'm happy to be corrected with folks in the queue, just that maybe some of those considerations could be taken out. They're not really that interesting. And then also that we need probably additional examples. So this is one very specific, best practice coming from one very specific instance, this organization. But I imagine there are others who have participated in such, meetings, or like I saw somebody, Stephen, I think, mentioned that this has been done before over Jabber. It'd be great to have to document some of those experiences. Like the APC documents itself, sort of, right? But there was nothing that we could take and just turn into a draft. We actually just had to write it from scratch because of the context. So I would encourage and welcome people who want to add to that with other examples. Next slide. And so the planned updates for this is like, I need to do a better copy editing job on this draft. There's some things that can be probably removed, and we'd like more examples in the annex. I think that's it. You can go to the next slide, which is where I can take issues, pull requests. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure. That's good. I did want to just mention, sorry, in the call for help that if anybody actually wants to try this out, that'd be kind of cool to refine this, like what works and what doesn't for the IETF. So it might need to actually be tried before it becomes actual guidance, if at any point it does that for Shmoo. So that's it. Thanks, everybody. I'll take questions now for sure.
Thanks. Just one thing, Mallory, like you can probably send a mail to the working group chairs mailing list, like, if you want to solicit the help for somebody to try this out. So that could be a good venue for you.
To the Shmoo list, or where?
No, to the working group chairs list. I'll send you a note. Like,
it's like unless everybody's like, this is a terrible idea, but yeah, I'd be happy. That's a good idea.
Trust me, like people are not shy here. If they think it's a terrible idea, you're going to hear about it. So don't worry
let's
about
hear
that.
it. We've got some people in the queue. Good.
Thanks, Matthew. You're first. Okay.
Matthew?
I'm unmuted. I hope you hear me now.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. One of the things that struck me really eerily similar to my current life experience when you talk about people ask for over and over for details about the meeting logistics. I have 5 kids right now in 4 different schools. A solid agenda with defined incomes, as you stated. I would like to see a standardized education plan across these different schools. And I'm wondering, is there similarities that what we're doing here to try to fix this problem in IETF, that we could be industry leaders or, best practice leaders for what all these unfortunate schools are going through, where they don't know if they're meeting in person or, meeting virtually one week to the other. We don't know either. And yet we're the Internet Engineering Task Force experts. I'll end my comment there.
I think you bring up a good point, Matthew, about how we can be leaders in this. I do think it would be a really nice thing for the IETF to document this sort of meeting style, or its use of mailing lists. That was something that came up on the list as well. Like, can we document essentially like IETF netiquette or best practices around this? Because like that's a huge contribution for people outside even of the IETF. Thanks.
Thanks. Martin, you're up next.
I was a little confused as to what exactly you're proposing for IETF. Is the model that in like a particular working group mailing list, you would just say, okay, we're having a meeting now, and there's 6 topics, and here's a thread for each of them, go?
Yeah, that could work. Yeah, I would say it needs a lot more planning than that. So you need to pick a good time, like just like you would do any meeting planning, right?
Sure.
It needs to be well thought out. You need to probably speak with the authors in advance about where their drafts are, what they want out of a meeting, what are people's goals for the meeting.
So I think one thing that I really value in a synchronous meeting is the fact that they're single-threaded, because what it provides you that you don't have on the current mailing list is there's just all these things going on, and no human being can keep track of context for 24 different threads at once. And it's just an opportunity to say, hey, everyone, like, shut up and pay attention to this thing just for 5 minutes, so it can get in front of your eyes. And like, I wonder if there's a way to structure something asynchronously that way. Like, there's sort of a topic, maybe there's a separate mailing list set up just for the meeting, and there's like a topic for the day or for a few days or whatever it takes to take that to exhaustion and move to the next thing. And maybe that would capture a little more of the value while, because we have a mailing list that's asynchronous and it does things well, but other things not so well, and maybe something what I just said would capture more of that value. Thanks.
That's great. I like that, those 2 suggested additions, like having a separate mailing list, because maybe you don't want everybody who's subscribed to your research or working group list to have to participate in the meeting or to see all that list traffic. And then the second thing you mentioned, which is that maybe you do the sort of topics one after the other. That is something that you can do, is like stagger the agenda items. So you open them maybe on different days, but then you sort of leave them open for the duration of the meeting. That can be a way of like getting people to focus on one, like the most important stuff in the beginning. And then I'll just also add that there's a section there on like mixed methodology. So it doesn't preclude you from actually having a synchronous moment, or maybe 2 or 3 synchronous moments where like maybe you're capturing people from different time zones, but then the collective narrative is the one that's happening on the list, because everybody's able to dip in and dip out as they need to, and you don't have to worry about waking up at midnight. Well, I woke up at midnight because I couldn't stay awake, but yeah, like we're having a hard time right now because we're all in different, parts of the world meeting on one time zone. So anyway, thank you for your comments. So.
Thanks. Larry, did you have a quick point to make on that? There's a bunch of people ahead of you in the line, so.
I just wanted to ask about the Git working group, which seems like a hybrid of using Git issues to create threads that then have some effect. But it's somewhat of a hybrid between mailing lists and other kinds of facilities. That might be a way of merging the 2, rather than a completely separate mechanism for using mailing lists only meetings to have meetings over Git repos to solve particular issues.
Cool, like a sprint. I think that's a good suggestion to maybe make a hat tip in the draft to infrastructure the working group or research group maybe already has to facilitate its work, such as GitHub. I mentioned the data tracker, of course, but there may be other things people are using to organize their work and to leverage the features there, because like everything has every feature now, right? More or less. That mailing
One
list.
thing I was concerned about, there was a discussion about working groups that don't meet at all. They're not here. There's no place for tourists to come who don't want to subscribe to all of the threads and everything. They expect a meeting to be one where they can get a sense of what their working group is up to. And maybe you explicitly want to allow for tourists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for those suggestions. I hope I'm not taking notes. I hope some of these suggestions make it in. I'm also seeing good stuff happening in the chat. I'm sorry I can't keep up, but I just really appreciate the engagement on this draft.
Sounds good. Thank you. So I'm cutting the line off at this point. Like we are running a little bit late. We do have extra time, but like just out of caution, I'll cut the line off at Phil. Braun, you're next.
As part of my thing, I'm taking the notes here, and I am catching pretty much all of this. So hopefully it'll be helpful to you, Mallory, when it comes through. I find that with mailing list threads, they go off topic very, very fast. And I was going to suggest the same thing, that something like GitHub Issues is better for this. But I also think that this is basically what we already do with discussions on the mailing list asynchronously over time. The hard bit is capturing and maintaining people's attentions. And a large part of the face-to-face meeting is the forcing function for capturing attention. The idea of spreading over a lot of time and having 1 week for each focused issue, it is hard for people to bring their attention to bear to that, and they'll only bring their attention to the things that they have a particular interest in, and you won't get that excess attention that's available at meetings. I think it's really important to have that still, because that's a lot of where the serendipity comes from.
I see. Yeah, and I just on the mailing list moderation point, like you said, we already do this to some degree. I do think it presents more of a challenge because of the volume of messages that might occur in a short amount of time. It was also mentioned in the chat about this, but it might be interesting, like when I was sort of looking at what are the existing RFCs related to mailing list in IETF, there aren't as many as I thought there would be. Maybe like, list moderation facilitation of that sort would be another draft or something that could be documented better. Anyway, thanks, Braun.
Thanks, Braun. Ted, you're up next.
So a couple things. One, I liked the document in general, but I thought it was a little thin on detail on some of the things that you just talked about here, and that I know we've talked about in the past in the many couches mailing list. It'd be nice to capture some of the discussion we've had actually in the document, like for example, the idea of having, 3 focus groups in different time zones where we meet in person and try to get clarity on something at times that work for people. I think it'd be nice to document that. I'm a little concerned about some of the things I'm hearing here, that this might turn into kind of a sociology study, which is interesting, but not really going to help us. Or, I mean, maybe it'll help us, but we really need a document that actually has some, makes some suggestions for what to do so that we can actually try it.
Yeah.
And finally, the one thing that I think Braun was mentioning, Git issues. And I have actually found that to be not so helpful, because the thing that actually is the big cognitive load for people participating in working groups is not being able to figure out which thread to go look at. It's figuring out what the current state of thought on the thread is.
Right.
And so if we don't actually make some active effort to capture the current state of thought on a particular thread, then the cognitive load for anybody who's participating is kind of huge. That's admittedly hard work, but it's something that working group chairs really need to do if they want to know what consensus is. So it would be good if that could be done, if we could come up with a methodology for doing that incrementally that was not such a heavy load on all of the participants that it couldn't be done. I think that's something we really need to think about if we're going to actually succeed in doing offline meetings. Because as I think several people have pointed out, the amount of work that's required to actually get up to speed on a particular topic when you're switching between topics is a lot. And so if we can kind of very quickly help people to get up to speed, then we're more likely to actually be able to make forward progress.
That's right. I think that's you're pointing out something that's really critical, which is why, I mean, maybe it's just, I have a bias. I will just say that. I should have said that in the beginning, that I'm a very textual person. I need to read something or look at it to understand it. I mean, we can have a conversation about it, but the next thing I'm going to do is go find the text version of that, right? Or I need to read it or write it down. So, I mean, one of the nice things so I'm coming from that place, right? Not everybody feels that way or has the same learning style. But I mean, if you have a thread, if you open a thread, right? here's the conversation. This is the agenda topic. You need to go watch this video, which is a presentation, and then read this draft. And then here's like a summary of this and that. And then by the end of this thread, we want to get to this place. And that's like the opening thread. I think that's nice for people to reference, right? If I'm dipping in and I'm like, oh, wow, there's been 25 messages since I woke up, or since I went to bed last night, I need to jump in here. You always sort of go back to the first one, which sort of sets the topic and lays all this out. But taking your point that there needs to be more detail, I sort of, one, just kind of needed to get my thoughts out, and two, didn't want to speculate too hard on what people would find interesting, because again, it's like based on an experience in a different context. And three, I just would like other people to also weigh in, not in the sense of like, oh, this could be an interesting experiment, like you said, but oh, I've tried this and it works for me, and here's like a suggestion you can include in this space, right? So very happy for folks to contribute to that list of stuff. And I'll try to keep elaborating too, based on the notes too, based on what people have found interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Charles?
Yeah, so I have a couple things. One, bringing for JCK. Sorry, I'm not sure who JCK is, but
John Clinton. John Clinton.
Oh, okay. So it's from John, and he's asking, have you experimented, and if not, maybe you need to think about rate limiting or other things you could do to prevent a small number, 1 or 3 people going back and forth, repeating themselves, basically pushing everyone else out of the conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, I saw that one. Kind of responded, which is to say that I think we have also this problem just in regular lists, and list moderation is really hard. But yeah, I think it does present a special challenge for list moderation. That could be one of the mixed methodologies, is to then perhaps call like a synchronous meeting, either by voice or by video and voice, to actually hash something out that seems to be particularly contentious, right? Where people just need to be able to have a conversation. So, but I think that is something to consider. So thank you for raising that.
Okay, and I also had my own comment. To me, I just think the overall concept of asynchronous meetings, I think I agree with, but I just don't think email is a good tool beyond kind of what we use it for already. I think wiki or something like that would be better, something where you're actually capturing the information and have it in a format that you can kind of grow and add and subtract from over time. And email doesn't work too well for that. So I mean, while I like the idea, I just think email is probably not the right tool for this type of collaboration, and that, you know, we should look at wikis. I think might be a better alternative.
And I think I mentioned this in the draft, like as far as organizing space, you know, place where you keep your resources and all of that. In the APC meeting situation, we always had a wiki, and the wiki was really just a repository for like the main, you know, official, like supporting documents, the reports, a place where people could also share their own documents, and it was like you could create a pointer to that. It seems like a bit of a slow mechanism. On the other end of the spectrum, you have something like Slack or Jabber, which to me is just so fast moving. Like it's asynchronous, but it's also not threaded. I mean, in Slack, you have different channels, so that is threaded. But I think the bar for sending a message or sending, you know, your view is so low that you have, it's just a lot of chatter, and it's not like an email where you have to compose, you know, a response, or you can do threaded inline responses, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think we should be thinking, I'm really open, of course, to including other mediums, but I always feel like there's going to be a trade-off. It's almost like a slider. It's like, you know, how facile do you want this to be at a cost of like comprehensibility or the ability to follow discussion, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So,
yeah, I was going to just say that trying to work through GitHub, you know, talking about pull requests or whatever, that really doesn't work for me, because it's like trying to edit RFCs in NROF. I mean, I'm entering an alien language that I just don't understand, and it's a whole set of terminology. So I think that I think that we should look beyond just GitHub. Back in the very early days of the web, my colleagues at MIT, Roger Hurwitz and John Mallory, put together an asynchronous discussion forum for Vice President Al Gore, the Open Meeting, which was successfully deployed for 2 weeks. Now, it did have moderations and it had about 50 people operating it. But I think at this point, it might be possible to get people to use that technology, particularly an IETF. But you know, we should really be looking beyond trying to repurpose a code manager as a discussion tool. The other thing that I'd like to say is that I've had experience of working in more than just the IETF. I worked in OASIS, I worked in W3C, and so on. The use of the meeting, the synchronous meetings, I found to be most useful to me has been when the synchronous time has been going through the issues list. So you go into the meeting knowing that these are the issues that we're going to discuss. We're not going to have exposition. We're not going to do anything else. We're just going to go through those pieces. And that, for me, is a very productive way. We applied that on SAML, and that allowed us to get to a working spec within 12 months. Yeah. So I you know, it's a question of how you use them and how the tools interact.
I agree. I agree.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. And Mallory, thank you very much for the draft. I know, like, you you got it in just at the last moment, so thank you very much for working hard on this. And it was a really good discussion. Hope you can capture some of it. There's like a bunch of stuff in the minutes, like when it gets published. So, like, please continue the discussions on the list. Thank you.
I will do. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Thanks. Charles, if you can step up. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, so yeah, now to talk about the hackathon and running a hackathon. If you could go to the next slide, please. So, for those of you who aren't that familiar with the hackathon, the whole idea is, you know, we collaborate to really focus on running code and developing utilities, ideas, sample code, things that are going to show practical implementations of IETF standards and help move the work of the IETF forward. This document provides a set of practices. You just go back. Yeah, it provides a set of practices for running IETF hackathons. And so it's not just about the virtual or online only hackathon experience that we have, which I know is the main focus of Shmoo. So if you look at this, just, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that's about regular hackathons. But Shmoo kind of gave me the, you know, that little nudge I needed to put this down. And then of course there's stuff in there about the online only aspects of it. So now we can go to the next slide. So the typical agenda of the IETF hackathon is it happens the weekend at the start of an IETF meeting. And we just tried that for the first one. It seemed like a good time to do it. And it worked out really well. So it kind of stuck. And it's a pretty intense weekend, as you can see from the schedule. You know, we try to make the most use of the time without really killing anyone because there's the whole IETF meeting coming up. But really, you know, we try to optimize the use of the time and let people, you know, make the best use of that time, let them collaborate. And it's optimized for in-person participation, but we have had remote participation from the start. And the reason we end when we do is really to pass the baton to other things like the newcomer event, which is very important. And we try to cater to bringing new people into the IETF with the hackathon. So that's important to us. And so anyways, that's the overall timing of it. Now you go to the next slide. So, you know, I mentioned it being mostly tailored for in-person. If you look at the last 3 in-person meetings that we had, I basically did some back of the napkin stats from that. And we're able to get an accurate count of how many people actually attend in person because we check them in at the door. Now for remote attendees, we don't have as accurate a count because there's no way of really knowing. All we know is, did they register? Did they sign up to attend remotely? My gut feel is that about the same number of people sign up for the hackathon to attend remotely and then don't show as don't register and then end up participating anyway. So I think it's about a wash. But what you can see here is that the majority of the people are in person, about 90%, and about 10% are remote. And the other thing that I think is important that I wanted to emphasize here is that we do have a lot of new people, with roughly 30%. An IETF hackathon is their first experience with the IETF. And for 40+% of the people, it's like it's their first time at an IETF hackathon. So catering to newcomers is actually an important thing. And I think if you see the growth of the hackathon, which is on the right there, you get a feel for, it is bringing in new people. And so having that experience is attractive to people. And I think it's important to realize that it's not just kind of the regular IETF clientele. We actually are appealing to a new crowd. Next slide, please. So IETF 107 was shaping up to be kind of just another successful hackathon, I would say. We had the typical number of early registrations and of projects lined up, and then COVID hit. And the IETF meeting shifted very quickly to online only. And with the hackathon, we weren't sure what to do. So we actually had this survey with the thought was, hey, what if we just keep it exactly as planned, but we'll just everyone be remote? And what we found out was that very few people actually wanted to do that. And even of those who were willing to go forward with it, they were spread out across many different projects. For example, we had like 40 different projects, and we had maybe, 22 people who wanted to still participate. So you only had one or two really on any given project. And the people leading the projects were oftentimes not the people who wanted to still go forward with it. So it just didn't seem like it was going to work, and we canceled it completely. Next slide. So for IETF 108, we had more advance notice that it was going to be an online meeting. And so we planned from the start for it, or not quite from the start, but still we had a bit more time to plan. And so what we did was we looked at the things that really made the IETF 107 hackathon not work. And the timing, that we normally do, which was fantastic for in-person meetings, was actually kind of a killer for these online only ones. So we switched it and we said, okay, forget this weekend thing. Let's do it the entire week before. And to try to ease the time zone problems, let's let individual teams schedule when they want to meet. And that way, at least we make it a little bit easier for people to gel around specific times. So pick the times that work for you, your small team during the course of the week, and just meet then, with the exception of a general opening and closing that was meant for everyone to attend if they could. And that's what we tried out. Next slide, please. So when you look at the draft, as I mentioned, it's really, the bulk of it is covering the hackathon in general. But there are these sections marked out as online only, where there's information added as a result of being able or having to have it online only. And so funding, there were some funding changes, as you can imagine. Some of your typical funding costs, like for the venue, for food, those go away. But there could be some additional costs too, which I haven't tabulated or whatever, but we do need the network for longer. We need it for a whole week before instead of just a couple of days before. Gather, if we wanted to be able to have continue to use that, there can be costs there. The timing I already talked about. The wiki, that is how we keep information leading into the hackathon and during the hackathon. That's kind of how we share information about all the projects. And so A couple things went away from that because we don't do the hack demo happy hour, the code lounge. Those are things that happen during the week of an in-person IETF meeting. They're not applicable, but we added a couple new things. The team schedule that I mentioned, where teams could schedule how and when they wanted to meet. And also we added a page about results presentations, like who wanted to do it. And just so that we could actually, instead of having people raise their hand or something like that, this was the mechanism that we used. And actually both those worked pretty well. WebEx accounts, we made those available to teams if they wanted to be able to use WebEx to facilitate meeting, but they're welcome to use something else. And we did make Gather available. And I mentioned CodeMD. If you look at on the right-hand side, it's a little small, but those are tables that are in the Gather space where hackathon teams can meet. And if they sit around the chairs there, they can enter an audio conference and a video conference. And then there is on the right one, there's a small whiteboard, the table on the left, there's a little CodeMD shared notepad. And those actually ended up being very useful for people because they could use those in addition to just their video conference capabilities. And then what you see at the top right is the list of projects in the schedule. Next slide, please. So another, what I think really cool innovation that came out of the fact that we had to go online only was this remote access to the network. So having access to the IETF network at a typical hackathon is very important because it's unfettered access to the internet. And we also, so that was always provided for the hackathon. And then the NOC has done a fantastic job both of getting that available early, but also accepting requests for those people who want wired access or who want special networking capabilities like an IPv6 only network, or something where they can control prefix delegation, or a whole slew of things that is actually really handy for hackathon projects due to the nature of the work we do in the IETF. So when we went to online only, the NOC kind of stepped up and just put this together where someone could connect into essentially a virtual IETF network using a Raspberry Pi with the recipe that the NOC provides, and then request a lot of these same capabilities. So now that allows teams to kind of meet on a network, a shared network to work on their projects together. And it's something that we'll continue to develop and make better. Next slide, please. So looking at how IETF 109 worked out online, about the same number of registrations as for 108, both of which are lower than what we would have for a typical in-person, but not terrible. The tough thing is we don't have a good mechanism for knowing how many of those people actually participated and how much they participated. What we do have accurate numbers for is how many people attended the kickoff and the closing. And you can see those are relatively small numbers, 37 and 42 for the kickoff and closing respectively for this meeting, and both of which were smaller than for IETF 108. And the guest faced from talking to people is the time zone was just inconvenient for people, more inconvenient than it was for 108 in general. We actually had more projects overall, so that was a good thing. And we had more people present the results of their projects. So, in some sense, it grew, just the number of people attending the kickoff and the closing shrunk. Next slide, please. And the main takeaways were that, the timing of the kickoff and the closing, that was really challenging. We kept those on Bangkok time, so for a lot of people, it was inconvenient. And then the format of having it all week helps, but at the same time, it's hard for people to break away from their day job or what they typically would be doing during the week. Whereas when it was on the weekend and they physically traveled there, no one's expecting them to be doing their day job. But when it's during the week, it was harder to justify that. And then Gather worked really well for those people who did use it. And as I mentioned before, the whiteboard and CodeMD tools actually did help with collaboration. So that was cool. Okay, next slide. So just today or yesterday, depending on your time zone, an updated version of the draft came out. And this experience from IETF 109 was captured. Also, thanks to Michael, who provided some great comments and suggestions. So to kind of add those intangible benefits of the hackathon that you get from collaborating in person and kind of in close contact with people over a weekend, that's really hard to have that same benefit when we don't meet online. And Benson provided some great comments too about how the format that we use for presentations and the fact that we're using GitHub, that's not really ideal. And like change tracking, you don't get that with a PDF. So if we switch to something like Markdown, we could get that. So that's something we're going to look at as an improvement. And then also Gather, I mentioned, worked well for people, but it does also require higher kind of bandwidth and CPU on the machine that you're using, especially due to its peer-to-peer nature, which is pretty cool how it works. But it does require a bit more horsepower and bandwidth. So next slide. So in terms of next steps, the plan is to continue to learn. We're going to have IETF 110 is online, the hackathon will be online. We already have some ideas, including adding these updated results presentation templates that Benson had mentioned. Now the online hackathon, it's definitely, from everyone I've talked to in the survey that we had, it's better than not having a hackathon, but the participation, the collaboration, the social interaction, all these things kind of suffer. We definitely don't get as much done. There's not as many people participating, not as many projects, and they don't devote as much time to it. It's not as effective. So I don't know if that's something that should be captured more in the draft. I kind of wanted to get people's opinion on that. Metrics, results, and survey results. I have some placeholders, but should that kind of information be more detailed? Right now, what I have is kind of my back of the napkin of looking at things and just coming up with some quick numbers, but should they be verifiable and more precise? Is that important? Sponsor benefits. Right now, the draft focuses on kind of the mechanics of running the hackathon. It doesn't talk about sponsorship that much, other than that there is a sponsor and what they need to do to make the event successful. But is that something that should be captured in this draft? And then these last two. Is it in a draft? It seemed like a natural way to bring it to this group and have people review it, right? That's the way we do things. But is that really the best way to capture this? Because it will evolve over time. And then the Shmoo working group, our folks here up for helping with this, because as I did mention, it covers the hackathon in general, not just online hackathons. But this still seemed like a good place to do it. So that was my thought, but I wanted to see what the working group thought about it as well. So happy to take questions and hear what people think and what the chairs think.
I think this is like a fun to have the discussion. But yeah, like let's figure out the actual mechanics. If it's like the draft RFC is the right way to publish this, or like maybe like a wiki that's maintained, because it's like pretty dynamic. So, but that's something we can discuss.
Okay, but for now, you think it's good to just kind of rev this until it gets a little more complete and then figure that out?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, and keeping it within Shmoo, that's okay too?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Michael, if you can queue up, I'll get your slides up.
Hi. I bought this nice blue suit last time we were in Bangkok, so I thought I should wear it. I should turn this fan off so you don't get my noise. Right, so I posted this document a few weeks ago in I guess in response to there. I named it after fine diners. I'm told the quote about how there's many lunches and fine dinners too. is really from an IETF comment, IEEE comment that someone made. But anyway, I just thought it was a good kind of name for now. Next slide, please. So I've done a lot of remote attendance. I'm not going to read you this slide, but I actually got the M-Bone audio to work once, and then we had MP3 streams, and I did a lot of that from 2004, 2005 till till this pandemic. Last few years, I've been to pretty much all the meetings, but I can tell you it would have been nice in the 90s when my employer were not particularly supportive. If I could have done that, I would have done it. And people said I'm a very busy person. Well, the problem is that we've actually created a very busy schedule. And so I want to talk about a little bit of that too. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, it's an opinion. So this is what my calendar looks like. I took a screenshot of it yesterday. And you can see that one gap in the plenary for some reason doesn't show up in my calendar, but I went to it. There's a number of gaps like this one where I do have a document in ADD, and I have a couple documents in Ops Area Working Group, which are happening right now. I find this is not, I would say, particularly busy. What's happened is that the IETF has created many small focused working groups, and that means that quite a number of people need to attend quite a number of meetings. And so this is the kind of scenario we have right now. Next slide, please. So this is Karsten's calendar. He posts a list, his eclectic list of IoT related things. And maybe if you do OSPF v3 only, that you go to 2 meetings and that's it. But I got to note that there's an awful lot of people at this meeting who maybe, have conflicts and other things. So even if you did only OSPF, I sure hope you'd be interested in maybe Shmoo and some other things. So I would claim that there's quite a number of people who have quite a number of conflicts and quite a number of issues with what's going on. And of course, you might be an area director, and we have a number of them came to this meeting, and I don't know how they managed because they probably had other meetings that they should have gone to. Next slide, please. So I wrote this document, and the structure of it, I've got a couple of comments, and there was an 01 based on Joel's feedback. And I said, well, this is what we did in 107, this is what we did in 108, and this is how I think we should do it slightly differently. Joel suggested and some other people suggested that repeating all the initial text is maybe decisive, not decisive, is causes people to disagree that I described it wrong and I should just not bother. And that's fine. I'm open to that suggestion. I just don't know how to say do this differently until we say what we did. And I could add IETF 109 to this if you like. Next slide, please. So as I said, we have a lot of small focused working groups. I've heard this week actually a number of things how this is really, really important and that we need to do it even more and we need them even more tightly focused. But that really means that there's more meetings. And so if we're going to have more meetings and more groups, then we need to do the bulk of the work in virtual interims. We can't come to a group meeting where we basically just rehash the stuff on the mailing list and this stuff. We've had various conversations about slideware versus issues versus other things. And I wish I'd had the time to actually put up the issues on this document. And I received a couple emails yesterday about those issues, and I would have liked to do that. So my suggestion is we keep the bulk of the work in virtual interims, and that we keep the approximately 6 hour is what people seem to be willing to tolerate of a virtual meeting for things that need the wider audiences. So BOFs are critically important. If I would, if I could, leave my own working group as a co-chair to go to a BOF for only one reason, and I would go to sit through the BOF and go, well, that was boring, I don't care. And that's the most important decision I can make, is that this is a piece of work that I don't care whether it happens or not. I don't have an issue, and therefore I don't need to know anymore. That's like the most important thing. If I have an issue, of course, it's going to happen. But that's where I think a lot of people need to go. And we have the same kind of thing with new work. We have all our dispatch groups now, plenary, and I think Shmoo is a pretty important meta work group. And we've had other things like RFC editor, things like that that have happened that many people can't attend because they are doing something else. And I think that we also, the other part that's important is for certain working groups, if they're new, we did this in 107, anyone was a new working group, they got a slot during that week. If they're particularly going through a difficult or interesting rechartering, or maybe they're just celebrating, they you know, there's some things they want to present, and there's some reasonable things, you know, we deployed this, and this, and isn't it wonderful? Next slide. Do I have another slide? I think that's the last one. Yeah. So the proposed structure I would suggest is we have between 2 and 6 tracks during the week. Historically, we've had 8 tracks during the week, plus people have added side meetings to it. And I would say that there's not a hard, fast rule that there has to be 6 or 2, but that in fact that there may be there's some space to do some experiments, to have more tracks, fewer tracks. For instance, 6-man, in my experience, for instance, attracts a lot of people from a lot of other working groups that probably should be there and paying attention to it. And maybe having only one competing item would be a good thing for that. But let's just call it an average of 4. Okay, so previously we had 8 hours of working group in person, 4.5 days, 8 tracks, 288 hours, right? And so I would say let's only do 100 hours, okay, of virtual sessions during the week. That means 4 tracks times 4 days. I guess I forgot to finish typing the rest of the formula. Look in the document, it's there. And I think 100 hours is reasonable. So basically, I'm not saying, we basically expanded our schedule and our accommodation of thing as the demand for more sessions is increased. And instead, I think we should put a limit, say 100 hours is enough during the week. Remember, we normally work a 40-hour week, right? Now that's 100 simultaneous hours, so that's 25 hours of time that people could really accommodate. I think that's the last slide. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So a side meeting. So I put this in, and actually I tried to get Jay to put a survey question as to how you, whether you, particularly in North America, whether you got up really early, like at 10:30 or 11 p.m. the night before, to attend the meeting, or whether you stayed up really late. So if you're on the west coast of North America, for instance, I believe the meeting winds up being 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. So you stay up late, and that's great. But that means that you're awake before the meeting as opposed to awake after the meeting. Whereas the Europeans, they got up early for this meeting, most cases, in which case a side meeting would happen most easily after the meeting. So if we're not going to accommodate side meetings during the 6 hours of our session, then if we want to have those meetings where we resolve something with, you know, 2 ADs and a working group chairs or something like that, or whatever that is required, then we need to figure out how we're going to do it. And if we're not all awake at the same time, then we need to figure that out. So thanks. Questions? I think that's the last slide. Suresh, you're talking, but I can't hear you. Am I dead? Is it me?
We can't hear you.
I can hear Michael, but we can't hear Suresh.
I got it. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So no, the mute like kept cycling. So yeah. So we'll take a few questions. Alyssa, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is not really a question. It's a comment. Well, maybe it's a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So one issue of concern to me, at least throughout this year, has been about the scheduling of the interims in the time zone. So you know, as we know, if we in general left the time zone selection up to the majority rule, then we would always land in a similar window that is biased towards North America and Europe. And so for any proposal that relies you know, more and more heavily on interims, which definitely has its upsides, I think it would be helpful to understand the perspectives of the community about whether we need to do something about time zone fairness for interims as well, in order to make sure that they remain accessible to people around the whole globe. So just kind of food for thought. I'm not expecting like an answer, but it would be good if that could be addressed somewhere in this discussion.
Completely right. I would say that's an error of omission on my part. I completely also agree with you that we mostly can't let people just schedule virtual interims whenever they want. We need to do some sharing of pain. On the other hand, we need to acknowledge that virtual interims are happening. So many of us did make special arrangements during this week to be able to stay up all night and sleep during the day or something like this. And that's painful for some people to be able to do. And if if your two people can't get there, then what are you going to do? So I don't have an answer to that, but I believe it is a tussle, and I believe that we should be essentially we should be negotiating rather than just using a popularity contest for that.
Thanks. Maria?
Yeah, hi. I probably also have more comment than a question. So, like, I was actually hoping that the working group chairs would like make the assessment themselves, because it's them to request a meeting slot during the meeting, or it's them to organize an interim meeting, and they know best how their working group works and how what the needs are. And I do think that we have seen an increase of interim meetings, which I think is a good thing, because for a long time we've been trying to get off this like 3 times a year deadline and be more continuous in work. As Alyssa said, there are also challenges, but we also see that kind of a lot of working groups kind of just requested a meeting because slot in the meeting because there's a meeting, and so that's what they always did. So instead of trying to drive this from the top, I think we really need the input from the working group chairs, but we also probably need to provide more recommendations, more guidance to the working group chairs about how to do this and how to do this differently than it was done, including time zones, right? Including having a way to more coordinate this a little bit. And that's where I think the work sits.
Well, so if the meeting scheduling was, and I was involved in it in 2012 to update the software, if the meeting scheduling was not so critical that we had to actually, you had to beg for your slot weeks and weeks ahead of time, then I think that would allow a different process. The process I would like to see is I would like to see the chair submits the meeting request to their AD, and the AD comes back and says, great, show me the agenda, right? What's the actual point here, right? What are you doing? And I'd like to see no come back, especially if they say, well, but you've had no virtual interims. Why aren't you doing this using the internet, right? And I think that pushback hasn't happened in physical meetings for whatever reason either. And we've had this conversation in, over 10 years at least. So we've just basically added bandwidth to the meetings, or tried to. And at this point, we're suffering from congestion, and we need to drop some packets, right? That's the answer.
So I basically agree with you. The point where I disagree is that I think the pushback shouldn't come from the ADs. It's not the AD's job to do that. It's the working group chairs that should be decided. And I think we're missing some training there. We're missing some guidance to working group chairs in order to like make this decision responsibly.
I agree with you. So I'm gonna still say that it's in that relationship between the AD and the working group chairs that has to happen. And you're saying it's more has to be led by the working group chairs, and I'm saying that the AD may have to actually provide some sticks as well as some carrots. That's all I'm trying to say.
I mean, there definitely is a room for some discussion and communication between the chairs and the ADs, but the chairs should be the one who actually know best about this.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. And I just teed up Martin's slide. Martin, if you can come up.
It's in the queue. No, he's not. Okay, great. Hello, everybody. I'm the author of 2 drafts that have been submitted to Shmoo. This is the first one. I apologize, I've been bad, and I've not updated this since the 0.0, in spite of a bit of email feedback when I first posted it. And the problems run up to the title, which keep saying things about canceling meetings and remote meetings and all that. And it's not, what it's actually about is what are the criteria to cancel an in-person meeting that is scheduled. And this grew out of the work that the LLC and the ISG, the LLC and the ISG worked out sort of an ad hoc process to decide on whether or not to cancel 107, which of course we did cancel, and then that was improved a little bit for 108, and now we have a pretty stable model. But it's still focused on the pandemic, of course, because that's the purpose of it. And this draft is meant to sort of generalize this to other sorts of events that could cause us to cancel. Next slide. Right. So you know, we had no choice but to just kind of make it up as we went along. We used the RFCs that existed for venue selection and sort of repurpose them for the cancellation decision to see if the site was still suitable, meeting those criteria. But again, we need to have something more general and just kind of say, what are the alternatives if we can't have an in-person meeting, and what is most desirable? What would the community most like to see in lieu of a in-person meeting? Next slide. Okay, so this draft defines 2 roles. The LLC is the one that actually does the assessment based on the criteria in this document. So they go and they look up the results. They're obviously aware whether or not their own staff and contractors can reach the location they're supposed to reach, which is an important logistical consideration, and they can look up things like safety guidelines. Regarding travel advisories, you know, the U.S. State Department, whatever its merits or not, have sort of been the go-to thing for us. I think a lot of insurance, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, our insurance policy refers to State Department guidance. You know, I would rather not get into a bike shed about the U.S. State Department, but we do certainly need another source for travel advisories to the United States. And so I wanted to pick another English-speaking country for the simple practical reason that the entire IETF staff, LLC staff, speaks English, which makes this kind of a practical thing to follow. But I certainly am open to suggestions beside the UK Foreign Office if people don't like that particular choice. I was disappointed to find out that the EU does not issue EU-level travel advisories, at least as far as I could find. The ISG's role is to decide whether or not technical progress is possible given the attendees. So there's a lot of soft restrictions like corporate travel restrictions or people making their own judgments not to sign up. And so whether people are, and that ideally is not like a strict percentage where, oh, well, 55% of the people are not attending, therefore we can't have it. What we did for 107 was actually talk to working group chairs who had a sense of who was going to be there or not, and sort of ask them individually, you know, to just get the sense the working group chairs, can you actually have a productive meeting? And of course, as time went on, like there were more cancellations and travel bans, and we couldn't have 107. But that would be the kind of thing the LLC is ill-equipped to judge, and I thought that was a proper IESG role. And I just want to point out, this is not something that happens necessarily 3 months before the meeting. Like a horrible example could be that, you know, in July we could actually be in San Francisco and there could be a serious earthquake on the Wednesday of the meeting, and we have to make an assessment whether to cancel it or to continue. And these sorts of criteria would be useful even at that late date. Next slide. Okay, this got a lot of comments, and I wanted to articulate that is not well, as it says there, this is not an assessment of the feasibility of these options. In fact, I've been told that some of them are probably extremely unlikely to be infeasible, but I did want to state some values here. And obviously, if there's nothing that can be done, then nothing can be done. So if it's an event like maybe some sort of, you know, maintenance problem at the hotel and there's another hotel available in the same city, I think that would be the optimal response. Postponement, you know, I think is self-explanatory. Then virtualization, which is what we've in fact doing because, you know, neither relocation or postponement would be helpful in the pandemic. And then of course, cancellation is the worst option. If it happens with extremely late notice, it may be all we can do. And of course that has, and we know that there's impacts on non-com. That's a whole other draft. Next slide. And then the last bit was refunds. Just some principles on when IETF should offer refunds for a canceled meeting. And you can read what it says. And the fifth one I think is important. Like, don't blow up the IETF in service of these principles. Next slide. I think that's the last one.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Great. So before I move on to my other draft, this is a good time for comments and questions. And of course, this, I mean, I will offer this up for adoption as a good basis of discussion, unless I'm going completely the wrong direction here. No comments?
Nope.
Okay. All right.
So Martin, like, you know, what do you want to do with this? Like, you know, you want to like kind of like try an adoption call at some point, or like, are you ready with this, or you're expecting more feedback?
Well, I did get some feedback, which again, I irresponsibly did not put into the draft and update. It fell off my to-do list. I will update this into a new draft based on some of the comments. Not all of them I'm going to take, so we can see what people say about that. Maybe that will generate another round of comments on the list. And
Okay.
And yeah, I would just hope that shortly after that we could do call for adoption.
Sounds good. Excellent. Thank you.
Mir is up.
Okay, Maria, go ahead.
Oh, here they come.
Yeah, sorry, I'm too slow following multiple sessions. So I think the one point which needs slightly more discussion is maybe this point about like trying to reallocate. I think this is usually just not practical, and I agree with you that like it's still worth considering, but maybe some more input from the LSC would be good as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly willing to scramble the priorities. I'm not married to that exact rank ordering, although I think cancellation should be last, and relocation in the same city should be first, or at least something reachable with the same airport.
Yeah, I mean, usually if your hotel booked, you have to rebook and so on. I'm not sure if there's ever has been a chance to relocate in the same city and so on. So, and to be honest, given that like we have now much more experience with online meetings, maybe this is a more valuable option than it was like a year ago. So yeah, I'm just not sure. I think there's like more discussion to be needed here, and some input from the LSC would be good.
Well, so the toughest call was putting postponement in ahead of virtualization, and like I could be very easily convinced to flip those two, because I think shifting the calendar is actually quite onerous for people. Yeah. But you know, your mileage may vary.
Anyway, let's take it to the list.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so now the infamous show of hands tool. So yes, so last time we had at 107, wait, no, sorry, 108, we had the virtual hum tool. That was an so humming, of course, is the most famous sort of bespoke IETF tradition in person meetings. And rather than try to make judgments about the hum tool, we tried to replicate as closely as we could. And so there was a lot of, it had a lot of features that were sort of odd and certainly not available off the shelf. Next slide. So I spent a fair amount of 108 getting feedback, just the informal conversations, and I know there were some formal methods of collecting notes. There's some people who just don't like humming, which I think is a little bit out of scope. But the attempt to obfuscate the result to avoid voting just led to a lot of confusion about what the results mean. And you could tell by like a lot of comments about it, people didn't understand the results unless they read the document. But like reading the spec is a sign that if you have to read the spec to understand the results, then we've sort of failed. And like humming has some informal cues in it that we didn't really successfully replicate. So people made bad assumptions of how it works. And so there's just a lot of trouble interpreting results. Okay, so I'm sorry. So I'll help the Jabber scribe out here and say that Jay says that relocation is pretty much impossible unless the venue owner has a spare venue. That is true. I mean, you've told me that before, Jay. I just refer to my original point that it's not an assessment of feasibility. Okay. Right. Anyway, so the virtual hum just became super vague, and so we actually just sort of threw it out and went with a show of hands. Next slide. So first of all, we recognized early on that we should have built a show of hands tool, just because who has read the draft is a super important question to ask at in-person meetings, and we didn't have that in the hum tool. So we were going to do that anyway after our realization. But we decided also that, and by we, I'm just saying the IESG, because we have to do this ad hoc because Shmoo is just building consensus now. We decided just to like trust the chairs, not to reuse this as a vote, to say, oh well, like 50 people said yes and 40 people said no, so we have consensus. And I think that trust has paid off today. I don't think we're seeing abuse of the use of hands tool. It's very simple to understand, like counts of people. And unlike real show of hands, we have made it anonymous. If there is a thing like who is volunteering to read the draft, you can use the chat since everybody's on Jabber now. Well, almost everybody's on Jabber. So we thought there was a good function for those sorts of things, and the anonymity might have some good dynamics. So we did deviate a little bit from perfectly replicating in-person show of hands. So we also consciously decided not to get super fancy with features. I know we've already had some interesting sort of enhancement requests, and we have, and we tried to take a little more agile approach. We put out a sort of minimum viable product and sort of see what things people really want to do. And so I anticipate some improvements in 110, and this draft is a great venue to kind of capture those requests. Next slide. I think that's the last one.
Yeah, that's it, Martin.
Okay, great. So comments, questions. I think this is, as Suresh said at the top, I think this is like the other draft, sort of on charter. And so assuming that we think the show of hands is closer to something like this should be further developed in Meet Echo land, then I think it was candidate for adoption. Of course, another discussion about Meet Echo, but that's not one I'm tackling here.
Steve, you're next.
Hi.
Steven? Yeah.
I think I disliked the humming tool at 108 and disliked the tool this time even more. So I would.
I'm happy to be consistent.
Yeah, why not? I think it's fine to keep playing with these things, but I don't think it would be valuable to attempt to get consensus on any of them. So I think continue to experiment, but I don't think it's really going to be useful to try and get consensus, because I think we'd either end up not getting consensus or getting consensus on something that will turn out to be useless.
Okay.
Stuart.
That may very well
Bob,
be.
yeah.
We can't reach consensus.
Bob, you're next.
Can I just clarify? I do think it may be possible to reach consensus, but I think that might be the worst outcome.
Okay.
Hi, Bob Hinden. So the reason I didn't like the hum tool as a working group chair is that I couldn't tell what percentage of the working group was actually humming. You didn't mention that. And that's, of course, the thing I like about the new show of hands tool is I can see, whether it's a lot of people in the room or no one in the room who's raising their hands. So I think so I liked it a lot better. It clearly needs some work. It's easy to not, given the way it's implemented in the tool, I think has been discussed on the tools list, but if it would pop up so everyone saw it, it would be better. But I think I think we should keep working on it, and I think this is, it's much better than what we did at the last IETF.
Well, I'm gratified to hear that. For your information, the not being able to tell how many people hummed is actually like a feature of virtual humming, not a bug. It was an intentional thing to obfuscate some things. And
but the reason I didn't like that is the working group chair not knowing that, it made it not useful at all to me.
Right. And like if you had like thought deeply, read the design and like studied it very carefully, you might have seen that it was a raw measure of volume, so that gave you some indication of how many people hummed. But like we got rid of that for the exactly reasons you described. So thanks for that.
Good.
Thanks, Bob. David?
David Skenazy. Thanks for bringing this up, Martin. So first off, I agree with Stephen. Please just don't try to get consensus on this. Just decide what you think is best and bring it on. Otherwise, we can argue about it for about a year, and then by the time we'll have gotten a tool that we agree on, the pandemic will be over. And then one thing I would just like to say, like definitely a lot of improvements. One thing that was incredibly frustrating for me as a chair this week was that the tool only had like two choices, raise your hand and not raise your hand. And so every hum I saw involved the chair saying, raise your hand means this, don't raise your hand means that. And so ideally, if we could make the tool so that the chairs, in the same way that the chairs can type in the question, which was incredibly helpful, having the chairs do multiple choice where they can fill in multiple things would be really great, because it's very common that in the working group you have three options. And one thing I'll add is don't make it a radio button, make it a checkbox, because at IETF it is pretty common for people to hum, like let's say there are three options, they'll hum for two. And so I think that would be also a feature to keep. So anyway, that's kind of my laundry list of features. I can bring that to the list, but otherwise, yeah, do this, pick something, make it so, keep iterating. This is it. Thanks.
All right, thanks, David. Two responses to that. First of all, yes, multiple choice is something we've heard quite a few times. With this whole MVP concept, we deliberately chose not to make the UI more complicated, but that is something that I think we will strongly consider for 110. Regarding not seeking consensus, so we will continue to. We're not going to wait for an RFC. We're going to continue to develop this tool, and it will hopefully improve, and by the end of this maybe we'll have something, and then we'll have that tool forever. So we could just have it forever without ever having a consensus on what it should do. Like that is like an outcome, I guess. But I don't know, if the working group does not want to have an RFC that describes this at the end, then we don't have to have one. We don't have to adopt this draft. But I'm open as to whether or not that's that's what this discussion is for, to see if we need to do that. Other comments? All right, we're on time.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks a lot, Martin. And thank you everybody for staying on. And sorry we ran a bit over our scheduled time, but we're still within the slot. So thank you very much for the fantastic discussions. There's at least one adoption call and potentially two going out to the list soon. And for the rest of the items, we keep on iterating. So thank you very much, and have a nice rest of the day for the meeting or night. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Nice. Yeah.
All right, you've got lots and lots of notes in the minutes there. Feel free to take
Thanks
it
a
on
lot,
now.
Ron.
I'm done. You're welcome.
Thanks a lot,
See you next
Ron.
time.
You're awesome.
Thanks for the
Thanks a
session.
lot. Okay. Thanks.
See ya.
Hey, and finally something in a good time zone for you. So.